Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sydney, and if you are new here, this is just a place where we can hang out, talk about true crime, conspiracy theories, scam stories, basically anything that I got going on in my head. We talk about it, we discuss it. Last week we talked about the Fire Festival, which was a good one. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I highly suggest you go listen to that story. That is a good one to be sure. So today we are going to be talking about the infamous Sallie house. So without any further ado, let's hop right into it. The Sallie house was built sometime in between 1867 and 1871. The dates aren't exactly clear, but this house was commissioned and built by a doctor named Charles Finney. He used the bottom half of the house for his practice, surgeries, examinations, that kind of thing. And the upper level was where he and his wife and 3 children lived. According to legends, one day in 1905, a mother brought in her sick child, a 7-year-old girl, to Dr. Charles Finney's office, begging for his help. She was in severe abdominal pain, and Dr. Charles Finney decided that this girl had appendicitis, and to avoid the child dying, he had to operate on her right away so her appendix wouldn't burst. Dr. Finney decided to start cutting into the child before the anesthesia had fully taken effect, resulting in this child dying from shock and trauma and pain on the operating table. And legend has it that this child's name was Sallie. The Finney family lived in this Atchison, Kansas home until around 1947, and at that time they sold the house. And the house had multiple different owners, and the hauntings were recorded here and there, although they're kind of few and far between. One story that I was able to find came from a mother who said that her daughter had an imaginary friend whose name was Sallie. Coincidence? I think not. When the mom's daughter kept getting in trouble, the daughter would state that it wasn't her fault, that Sallie had actually done these bad deeds, or that Sallie had told her to do these bad deeds. And the mother just thought it was her child going through, that stage in life where she has an imaginary friend. By far the most detailed and severe haunting of the Sallie house occurred when the Pickman family moved in. Tony and Debra Pickman moved into the Second Street home in January of 1993. At this time, Debra was pregnant with their son, who was born in June of 1993. Tony and Debra didn't really realize anything strange going on until their son was born. At that point, they had a family dog that would start growling and barking in the nursery of the home, which turned out to be one of the most active spots in the home for paranormal activity. On one occasion, Debra was talking to one of their neighbors, and the neighbor inquired why their nursery light was always on all hours of the night when they had a baby trying to sleep in that room. Debra insisted that every time they left the nursery, they would turn off the light, because why would you leave a light on in your sleeping baby's room? But the neighbor insisted that that light was on all hours of the night. So, kind of strange, maybe not alarming, but kind of weird. At this point as well, Debra and Tony were getting woken up every hour on the hour by their son, who seemingly would not and could not sleep through the night. By July of 1993, Tony and Debra were exhausted from being up basically 24/7 taking care of their son. Around this time, Debra had her sister Karen come in to just stay with the Pickmans, kind of help with their son, and make it so that Tony and Debra could have just a few days of rest and relaxation. The last night that Debra's sister was in town, they decided once the baby was put to sleep that they were just going to rent a few movies, hang out, relax on their last night together as a family. At one point, Tony excused himself and he went to check up on their son in the nursery, but when he got up there and flicked on the light, a bunch of the child's stuffed animals were sitting in a circle in the middle of the room with their backs turned towards each other, which isn't normal. Tony came downstairs and he was like, okay guys, this is really cute, this is really funny, but which one of you guys set up all the stuffed animals like that? And he assumed that it was either Debra or her sister or one of Tony's brothers who lived next door. But once Tony found out that nobody had been in that room since they put the baby to sleep, they were all a little bit freaked out. So they went upstairs, all three of them, Tony, Debra, and Karen as well, Debra's sister. And they walked up to the nursery, they flicked that light on, and sure enough, there were the stuffed animals sitting perfectly in a circle. So they just kind of tried to brush it off, and they put all the stuffed animals back in their proper spots, and flicked off the light, and went back downstairs. The three of them had not even made it halfway down the stairs when they heard the flick of the light switch, and they turned around, made their way back up to the nursery, and found out that, sure enough, everything, all the stuffed animals were sitting right back in the circle. This was kind of a big red flag, obviously, for the Pickmans, and they started to take this haunting a little bit more seriously. The next day, Tony was talking to his brother, who had just come over to the house for a little bit, and he was telling his brother about the events from the night before, the fact that they had some sort of weird thing going on in the house, some sort of spirit, some sort of something. And all of a sudden, one of their son's toys, a little cute stuffed bear, started spinning around in a circle right in front of both of their very eyes. And if I can find it, there is allegedly a picture of this bear spinning around on its axis. It's really creepy. And the brother, Tony's brother, he's like, I'm never coming back to this house. I am never coming back here. If you hear little cat zoomies going on, I cannot contain Fred. She's an animal. She's an animal. That very same day, Tony and Debra decided that they had had enough for right now and they needed to leave the house and just clear their minds. So as Tony was strapping their son into his car seat, he felt something almost like a sting on his back, like he thought he had been stung by like a wasp or a bee or something. But he just ignored it because they were trying to get out of the house in a hurry for obvious reasons. So once they had made it safe and sound to Tony's parents' house, Debra decided to take a peek at Tony's back just to see what had stung him or like how severe it was. And when she lifted up his shirt, she found 4 to 6 inch scratch marks all down Tony's back. And this was the first time that this entity, this ghost, had made its mark on Tony. But it wouldn't be the last. At this point, Tony and Debra decided that they needed help. This was bigger than them and they were going to need help to control whatever was living in their house with them. They asked their friend and psychic Barbara Connors for help identifying what this ghost might be, how to treat whatever was living in their house, that sort of thing. Barbara came to the conclusion that the spirit they were dealing with was actually an entity of a little girl whose name was Sallie. Being that Tony and Debra had never had to deal with any sort of spirit or entity, especially one of a child, Barbara gave them some tips and tricks on how to make their lives with Sallie a little bit smoother. Barbara suggested that Debra and Tony discipline Sallie when she was being bad. Send her to her room or, scold her, that sort of thing. Treat her like an actual child. Tony was kind of skeptical of this idea, being that he was very Catholic, but Debra was open to giving Sallie a chance to be good. At one point, the Pickmans even bought Sallie a baby doll toy of her own. They wrapped it up beautifully and they placed it in the corner of the nursery, which was a spot where Sallie was very active. Barbara told the Pickmans that this is where Sallie likes to be. So they set it up there and they waited. After weeks and weeks of the doll not being touched, Debra walked into the nursery one day and found the baby doll laying in their son's crib in the nursery. Debra looked over to the corner and then got a little bit freaked out because the box looked exactly as it had all the days and weeks before. It was still immaculately wrapped, but the doll was out and sitting there. So this is how they knew that this was the real deal. Like, they were actually dealing with a ghost, because how did Sallie take a baby doll out of a box which was wrapped without the box being touched? It was just very strange. I'll say more about what I think at the end, but if this was happening in my house, I have no idea what I would do. Like, I wouldn't have the money to move, and I don't think the Pickmans, they weren't wealthy, so I feel like they couldn't just up and move. Although the Pickmans thought that this doll acted as a peace offering, the hauntings did not stop. One day after a long night shift, Tony came home and was just grabbing some orange juice out of the fridge. And when he closed the fridge, he saw the spirit of a little girl who was presumably Sallie. She was wearing all white and she was in clothes from the 1800s, which lines up with the original legend of Sallie, who died in that house so many years ago. Tony was obviously super duper scared, but the spirit eventually disappeared. And again, there are pictures of a drawing that Tony drew depicting this little girl, and she looks very sweet. She looks very cute, but she was not very sweet and absolutely not cute. The second time Tony saw Sallie was much scarier than the first. Tony was just chilling in bed. He was sleeping, getting some Z's. All of a sudden, Tony woke up to, again, this little girl spirit standing next to him. And the spirit started tugging on his arm, and he was kind of trying to pull his arm back. And after the third or fourth kind of like tug-of-war thing they had going on, Sallie's face turned from a cute little girl to like a half animal type deal with rotting flesh and like maggots coming out of her skin. And this obviously scared Tony a lot. And it seemed that the energy and the bad things happening were more focused on Tony rather than Debra or their son. Throughout their time living at the Sallie house, the Pickmans experienced everything from disembodied voices, shadow people, lights flickering on and off, candles going out, cold spots in the house. Even some of their family photos started to discolor and blur as time went on, which I thought was super strange. I'd never really heard of that happening. Other times they'd come in and find just like randomly lit fires, or one time they had this rose, just like a rose sitting out on their counter, and they came into the room and it had smoldered from the inside out. So the inside petals were all burnt, but the outside petals weren't burnt. Another time they had unlit candles as kind of like a decoration, and the candles just randomly had like dried wax on these never lit candles, and they were like, instead of the wax coming down, it was like floating up to the top of the candle. So some spooky shit. Probably the most convincing evidence happened during the filmings of a TV show called Sightings, and this happened while the Pickmans were both living in the house, and then they also did some segments once the Pickmans had actually moved out. But while the Sightings crew and team were there, they actually caught 9 full uncut minutes of scratches appearing on Tony's stomach. And throughout their entire time filming, random scratches would just appear on Tony's arms, his face, his torso. It was really bad, and they became more and more severe. Like sometimes they would just start out as like little scratches, but then over the next few minutes they would turn into welts that would start bleeding. So this was really dangerous for Tony to even be living in this house. And it seemed pretty obvious by this point that whatever the spirit was not an innocent little girl who lost her way. It was obvious that this was a demon pretending to be a little girl. And life just became a lot harder for Tony after the Sightings investigation. Voices would pester Tony as he was trying to sleep. He'd hear scratching from like behind the wall when he was trying to sleep, and it made his mental health obviously decline because he was in just this constant state of paranoia and fear. And as the hauntings grew more and more severe for Tony, he became more and more angry at Debra for reasons he couldn't explain. His thoughts towards his wife Debra were getting more and more dark. He was getting angrier and angrier at her for seemingly no reason. Whenever Tony was within the house, he just got these horrible, horrible ideas of hurting and killing Debra. The strange thing about this was, though, it wasn't Tony's own mind seemingly doing this to him. It was something within the house, because whenever he left the house, his mind would immediately clear and he would think, oh my God, what was I going to do to my wife? The breaking point for Tony happened one day when Debra was at work, and he went down to the kitchen, took out a kitchen knife, went up to the bedroom, and was 100% certain that when Debra got home, he was going to kill her. He took his son to his parents' house, and immediately once he and his son got out of the house, he kind of just broke down because he knew that he would have killed Debra if he was still within that house. Because of the thoughts and the feelings that Tony was having, as well as Living in kind of a constant state of fear for the whole entire Pickman family, they decided it would be best to move out. On their last night in the house, Debra and Tony had a friend with them. Her name was Renee, and she was also psychic. And they pulled up to their house, and Renee looked up, and she could see a large looming shadow figure in one of their upstairs windows. This figure appeared to stand up and walk away from the window. Renee told this to Debra and Tony, but they still decided to go into the house. I couldn't find out why. Like, I would not be going into the house if I saw that. I wouldn't be going into the house anymore at all. As Tony and Debra were saging their house, just trying to get any last bad vibes out of there, Tony was actually thrown across the room in the master bedroom and crashed into the wall. Debra and Renee tried to go and help him get back up, but they were like tugging on him and he wouldn't get up. It was as if something was like pinning him down to the floor. And this was thankfully the last instance that occurred for the Pickman family at the Sallie house. In October of 1994, the Pickmans finally moved out, and they moved 9 blocks away from the Sallie house. So they still lived in Atchison, Kansas, but they were out of the house, and the spirits didn't follow them, and they just tried to live a normal, happy life, which I love for them because they deserve it after everything that they had to go through. Tony and Debra have actually returned to the house many times for different interviews. At first it was just Debra because a lot of the spirits and hauntings didn't happen to her personally. It happened more to Tony. So after some time had passed, he finally joined his wife to do some of these interviews within the Sallie house. In 2009, Debra Pickman wrote a book about the Sallie house. This book is entitled Sallie House Hauntings, a true story by Debra Pickman. The Sallie house is still up and open to the public to this very day. Nobody lives in that house, but you can go on self-guided tours, or you can even stay the night in the infamous Sallie house for $125 per night per person. If you guys like this topic and you want a little bit more information on it, I would highly suggest that you guys watch the BuzzFeed Unsolved Supernatural video on it. It's like an hour-long investigation. It's super funny, super great. They actually get some pretty good evidence, which they don't usually get, so check it out. My thoughts on this is that this house has some of the most intriguing paranormal evidence that I've ever seen. The scratches that were appearing on Tony, some of the stories, some of the EVP readings that paranormal investigators have gotten. If you guys liked sort of paranormal investigations, that sort of thing, the sightings episode is up on YouTube. I would suggest you guys watch it. They use some, older technology, obviously, because it was made in the 90s, but it has some really interesting facts about the Sallie house as well as some interesting evidence. I definitely think that this was not a child entity. This was something much darker, if not more than one darker entity living there. Some people think that the ghost of Charles Finney could be the actual ghost that is appearing to be a little girl. Although there's not much evidence to back this up, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think that that's much more likely than a little girl that died of appendicitis just trying to haunt, people that were trying to nurture her, take care of her as best they could. The Pickmans really did their best to make sure that Sallie felt welcome in their home, felt comfortable. So the fact that the spirit then just ramped up and got more violent, it just doesn't really make sense. So I think it definitely had to be something a lot darker. But anyways, guys, that is all I have for you today. I really hoped that you enjoyed this deep dive into the Sallie house. Leave it in the comments below. Would you ever visit the Sallie house? Do you want to go to the Sallie house? Are you a skeptic? I'm a true believer 100%, so I'm interested to know what you guys are. But yeah, I hope that you guys have a beautiful, wonderful rest of your day and continue to be the bad bitches that you are. Bye, guys.